1066 and the Battle of Hastings. The day England changed forever. We thought we were standing on the hill that would save England. By dusk, I could feel the lie of that hope in the blood and mud beneath my boots. Edward the Confessor was dead, and with him, it felt like the old order of England had gone cold overnight. I remember the first days after his death in January of 1066 as a time of whispers, messengers, and hard faces. Edward had no son to leave the crown to, and that single fact seemed to crack the whole kingdom open. Edward had no son to leave the crown to, and that single fact seemed to crack the whole kingdom open. Men who had served him began speaking too quickly and too carefully. Great lords looked at one another like wolves, deciding whether the snow was deep enough to hide their tracks. In the halls and the yards, everyone seemed to know that the next king would not simply inherit a crown. He would have to take it from the hands of those who believed they had the stronger claim. Harold Godwinson moved first, or at least he moved fastest. I was not in the royal chamber when he was chosen, but I heard the talk as it spread through the country. Some said Edward had named Harold. Others said the dying king had only meant to give him the realm's protection until a lawful heir could be found. Whatever was said, Harold took the throne and was crowned King Harold II. He was a powerful man, and many of us believed England needed a powerful man then. The land was not quiet. The sea itself seemed to be waiting, because Harold was not the only one who wanted the crown. Across the water, William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the throne long before. He said Harold had sworn an oath to support that claim. The stories of that oath reached us in different forms depending on who told them, but the message was always the same. William believed England was his by right. He gathered ships, soldiers, and horses. He waited for the right wind. The whole coast seemed to brace itself for him. At the same time, another threat came from the north. King Harald Hardrada of Norway landed with his own army, and suddenly Harold Godwinson had to run north to face a different invasion entirely. That was the great misery of the year. The kingdom was never allowed to settle. Men were called up, sent out, recalled, and called up again. Food had to be gathered for armies. Horses had to be fed. Weapons had to be checked. Every road seemed full of sweat and rumor. When Harold met the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge on 25 September, he won. That victory should have lifted every heart in England. Instead, it left us exhausted. I heard later how hard that march had been. Harold's men had gone north in haste, fought hard, and then had to turn around and come south again with little rest. That was the part people spoke of in low voices. Victory did not mean safety. It meant the king and his army were tired, and time itself was now working against them. By the time the Norman fleet finally crossed the Channel, Harold had already spent men, strength, and daylight. We all knew William had landed in the south. Word came that he had built a fortification at Hastings, and was laying waste to the countryside to force Harold's hand. Villages burned. Livestock was taken. Smoke rose over the land. We heard that the Normans included cavalry, infantry, and archers. A combination we had not faced in one place in quite the same way. Our own men, by contrast, were mostly fighting on foot, standing in close ranks, shoulder to shoulder, behind shields. That had always been our strength. The shield wall, solid, heavy, unmoving. A wall of wood, iron, sweat, and stubbornness. I was there with Harold's host when we came south at last. We had marched hard from the north, and the road into Sussex seemed longer than it had any right to be. We were tired before we ever saw the enemy. Our feet were raw, our legs heavy, and our minds sharpened by worry. Yet there was still confidence among many of us. We had beaten one invader already. We had the king himself with us. We believed that if we held the hill, the Normans would break against us and fall away. On the morning of 14 October, the air felt thin and bright. the kind of cold that wakes your skin and makes every breath sharp. I remember the hill near Hastings, though men will argue forever about the exact ground. To us then, it was simply the place where England gathered itself and waited. The slope rose before us. Below, the Norman camps spread in ordered bands, and their army moved with a discipline that made my stomach tighten. I could see the glint of helmets, the restless shapes of horses, the darker line of footmen, and farther out, the men with bows. They seemed many, though none of us could have counted them accurately. Some later would say the armies were huge. Others would say they were far smaller. To me, in that hour, they were large enough. We took our place in the shield wall. The front rank locked shields edge to edge, and the men behind pressed in close. It was difficult to breathe properly in such a line, but that was part of its strength. No man stood alone. No man could easily be dragged out. We were packed so tightly that I could feel the heat of the bodies beside me through the wool and leather of my clothing. I could hear the scrape of iron, the cough of nervous men, the low prayers of others. Somewhere behind us, Harold's banners stood above the line. His presence steadied the men. We believed the hill would do the rest. The first arrows came before the first true charge. I heard the sound before I saw the shafts, a faint hiss that turned suddenly into hard strikes against shields and helms. Some fell short. Some hissed over our heads and into the earth behind. The archers worked from a distance, trying to break our nerve. Then the Norman foot moved forward, and the cavalry followed. The horses looked enormous to me, darker and heavier than I had imagined, their riders leaning down behind shields and spears. The hill itself made their advance harder. They had to climb into us. That seemed like a blessing, and for a time, it was. We held them. Their first assaults broke against the wall of shields and spear points. Men shouted. Men fell. I saw a Norman rider stumble and vanish beneath the press. I saw one of our own swing an axe so hard that the blade bit into a horse's neck and sent the animal crashing sideways. The noise was unlike anything I had known. Wood cracking, men yelling in two languages, horses screaming, metal striking metal. The air filled with dust kicked up by hundreds of feet. It drifted into our mouths and made every breath taste dry and bitter. There was pride in that moment, ugly and fierce. We believed the hill and the wall would hold. We thought the Normans would exhaust themselves against us and lose heart. Some of their men began to falter. I saw their lines swell, retreat, and press again, then retreat once more. It was difficult from where I stood to know whether they were truly breaking or merely repositioning. Battle does that to a man. It reduces the world to what is in front of his eyes and the next blow he expects to receive. I remember looking downhill and seeing how the Normans used their different troops together. The archers, then the foot, then the cavalry. Not all at once, but in waves. Their commanders were not throwing men away blindly. They were testing us, trying for weakness, looking for a place where our line would open. We gave them little. Our shield wall was dense and stubborn. For a while I felt something close to confidence. Then the feeling changed. Not all at once, but enough to notice. The sun climbed. Sweat ran under my mail. My arms began to feel heavier each time I lifted my shield. Men beside me were breathing harder now. Some had blood on their faces from small cuts that seemed too minor to matter until they kept bleeding. We had been standing and fighting for hours, and the strain of it began to show. Our line did not break, but it did not feel as solid as before. Men were tiring. The hill still helped us, but the day was wearing us down. Then came the moment when the battle's shape seemed to change. I saw movement among the Normans. A shout went up. Their cavalry pulled back, then surged forward again, and some of our men, seeing that retreat gave way in pursuit. Whether it was planned or born from panic, I cannot say. On that field, those two things often look the same. I only know that men began to move downhill after them. Our line, which had seemed like a single body, suddenly had gaps in it. I remember feeling my own certainty pull apart. The wall was no longer a wall. It was a series of struggling parts, each trying to hold where the whole had already begun to strain. Then the real horror started. The Normans seemed to seize upon that movement. Their riders turned. Their foot pressed in. More arrows fell. One of our wings, or perhaps only a portion of the line, was drawn away in confusion. Dust rose thickly now, and through it I could barely make out faces. I heard someone scream that the Duke was dead. Another voice answered that it was a trick. Then another shout ran through the field, sharper and more desperate. "Look to the standard! Look to the king!" That was when I realized something was terribly wrong. Not because the Normans had made a grand new move that I could understand clearly. Battle was too confused for that. But because the men around me began to sound different. The certainty had gone out of their voices. Orders were repeated instead of obeyed. Men looked uphill and downhill at once, trying to understand where the danger actually was. That was how fear entered, not as a scream, but as uncertainty. I could not see Harold at first, only the press of men around the king's banner, the shuddering line, the weapons rising and falling. Then I heard the rumor that reached us like wind through tall grass. Harold had been struck. Some said an arrow had pierced him. Others said he had been cut down after that. The story changed from mouth to mouth even before the day was done, and I will not pretend to know the exact truth. I only know that at some point the king was gone from the line, and the loss of him hit harder than any blade. When a king falls in the midst of battle, men do not simply grieve. They lose the shape of the fight. We had stood because he stood. We had endured because we believed he endured with us. Now the line began to buckle in places. The shield wall was still there in patches, still fierce in spots, but it no longer felt united. Norman cavalry pressed the openings. Archers continued to rain down arrows. Foot soldiers pushed close enough to strike at men who could no longer keep their shields locked properly. The hill, which had seemed to protect us, was now a place of falling, stumbling bodies. I remember one man beside me, a young Thane's retainer from somewhere in the Midlands, who kept shouting the king's name as if calling him back would somehow make it so. He had blood running from his temple. His shield arm trembled. Then he was hit again and dropped to one knee. I tried to pull him up, but the crowd shoved us apart. That was another terrible thing about that day. It was not one single disaster. It was hundreds of small ones, each happening just out of reach. The Normans pressed harder. Their horses came close enough that I could smell them, sweat and churned earth, and the sharp animal heat of fear. Men on our side struck upward at riders. Some horses reared. Some riders were thrown. But the flow of the battle had turned against us now, and every blow we landed seemed swallowed by the larger movement around it. The field had become too wide, the fighting too scattered, and the losses too deep. I do not know exactly when the English resistance truly collapsed. There was no trumpet for it, no banner lowered in a clear and proper way. It was more like a great branch snapping inside a storm. One moment men were still trying to stand in place. The next they were running, falling back, dragging the wounded, or simply turning their heads in the wrong direction because they could no longer tell where the line had gone. And then the worst part of all. Harold was dead. The news passed through us not as a speech but as a chill. Some men fought on for a little while after that. Some tried to gather near the king's remaining standard. Others fled. I did not feel shame in those first moments, only the raw instinct to live. The hill behind us was no longer a position. It was an escape route. Though even that word feels wrong, because there was no order in the retreat. There was just broken movement and the sound of pursuit. I ran when I should have stayed, though I do not know if staying would have changed anything. I remember stumbling over uneven ground, slipping in mud, gasping for breath that felt too hot in my chest. I remember looking back and seeing the battlefield still alive with violent smoke and motion. The Norman banners remained upright. Their men pressed forward. Ours had lost the center that held them together. Somewhere in that confusion, Harold's body was taken up or left behind. Later stories would tell of his death in different ways. One famous tale says an arrow struck his eye. Another says he was cut down by sword or lance after being wounded. What I know is this: by the time the sun went lower and the field belonged to William, Harold was no longer there to command us, and that absence mattered more than any tale told later to decorate it. The fighting went on until the English line could no longer be reformed. William had not won in an instant. He had won by patience, by pressure, by using archers, infantry, and cavalry together, until our shield wall, worn out by the day and by the march that brought us there, finally gave way. That is the part the proudest men sometimes forget. Victory is often not one overwhelming blow. It is the moment when exhaustion becomes stronger than courage. When the field finally quieted, it did not feel like peace. It felt emptied. The dead lay where they had fallen, and the wounded called out in voices too weak to carry far. Smoke drifted low over the ground. The smell of blood mixed with churned earth and hoarse sweat. I walked among men I had seen standing beside me at dawn and could barely recognize them now. Faces were covered in dust and dark with blood. Shields were split. Helms were dented. The proud line we had trusted was gone, replaced by bodies and silence. William had won, and with that victory, everything in England began to change. We knew it even then, before the full shape of it could be spoken. The men who had led us were dead or scattered. The road north, which had seemed so long only days before, now felt like a road to another life entirely. Harold's death did not merely end a battle. It ended a claim to the throne. It broke the resistance that had stood against the Normans and left the kingdom open to a new ruler, a new elite, new laws, new names in power. I did not see William become king, but I heard of his coronation on Christmas Day at Westminster Abbey, and the date struck me like a wound that would not close. 25 December. Toro, a holy day. A new king crowned in the heart of England after the slaughter at Hastings. William the Duke became William the Conqueror, and the title fit him because conquest was now the truth of the land. Not persuasion, not election, conquest. In the months that followed, the consequences spread in every direction. Lands changed hands. Old lords were replaced by Norman men. Castles, where there had been open ground. The language of power began to shift. The old English ruling order was broken, not just at the top, but throughout the country, because once the crown changed, the whole structure beneath it began to move. Men like me, who had stood in that shield wall, could feel the country becoming something else before our eyes. And the Bayeux tapestry, which later generations would study, would show that great struggle in thread and color, though not always exactly as it happened. It would preserve the memory of the invasion and the battle. But memory and truth are not always the same thing. On that field, I saw enough to know that the story would be told many times, and not all of it would be true in the same way. I still remember the hill, the weight of the shield, and the moment the line began to fail. A kingdom can look solid right up until the instant it breaks, and then it becomes a different country in a single day. That is what Hastings left behind. Not just bodies on a field, but a new England built over the ruins of the old one. The Norman victory at Hastings made 1066 the year England was remade.